Hello and welcome to RPG Research. I'm your host, Hawk Robinson, and today is our weekly Saturday Game Master Training Day from 9 a.m. to noon here on twitch.tv/RPG Research. Today, Dan Ivy's joining us here locally in the Spokane studio, and then joining us remotely, we have Dan down in Brazil and Danielle in Airway Heights.
It's the trifecta of Daniels.
Yes, all with three variations on Dan. It's going to be interesting. How are you doing, Dan, in Brazil? How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. It's currently 3 p.m. where I am, so I feel better rested than the previous session I've been, which was during the dead of midnight.
Right.
And I must admit that I don't quite know what we're playing today, so I just have to know so I can prepare real quickly.
I don't know if we're actually playing any one thing today. We're going to be working on specific game mastering techniques today, which may include little snippets of play. So one of the first things we wanted to work on today is getting each of you to come up with a minimum of 5 distinctive voices. Now maybe we won't do that first thing since some of us are still kind of waking up. But that's high on the to-do list, is getting 5 distinctive voices to use for NPCs. Because what the research shows is that immersion levels are higher when the GM sets the example of using different voices. And also then, of course, even more so if the players are doing the same with their characters, and it reduces some of the negative bleed effects when one character is doing something that might be offensive to another character, and the other player taking it less offensively than if it was not voiced. So it's an important thing. You don't have to be a voice actor. You don't have to have, the perfect voices, but it needs to be something that if you suddenly had to pull a golem and have a conversation with 5 NPCs amongst themselves, for example, in a court intrigue situation, whether it's a royal court or a jurisprudence court, where you have a bunch of people that you need everybody to kind of follow along in dialogue that the GM's kind of doing at the time, you want to have a handful of distinctive voices. The good thing is usually in any one scene, you don't usually need more than 1 or 2 voices, usually. And so the good thing is if you've got, 5 or more, people will kind of forgive you if you're kind of using similar voices as long as they're kind of spread out over time. It's better than no voices or just 1 or 2 voices. Mm-hmm. If you can expand your repertoire more, great. But
I just want to tell that I'm undergoing an acting course, and they actually do give out tips on how to deal with voice in general. They do train certain specific voices, but we generally emphasize the overall health of your voice. And if you want, I can relay some of the tips I've been given if it helps. If we have time.
Definitely welcomed. So I went through theater quite a bit as well long ago, and I used to perform on stage a lot. Now it's pretty intermittent in my acting, but and certainly they're good tips. So yes, we'll definitely want to cover that. So I'll be happy to have you do that. Generally, the GM doesn't have the same challenges as a stage actor with straining your voice, unless you're in a noisy environment like we are in public settings like community centers and such. Then often some of those problems are similar to an actor, where you need to project your voice loudly and clearly and enunciate well, so you can be heard to say from the back of the line, "Yes, I'm eligible for food stamps," which is the starving actor joke. But it is an important thing, because yes, if you're having to use your voice at length, and you're straining it, it's going to give out on you very quickly if you're not keeping in account your body posture, your diaphragm, your breathing, the tension on your neck and shoulders and jaw. There's a lot of considerations there. to take into account if you want to be able to be heard in a noisy environment. We're going to start with in a quiet environment where you have a game room at home or at a library or wherever, where you don't have to be really loud, and so it's just a matter of getting through a 3 or 4 hour game session, which is still considerable because the DM does the majority of the talking. So again, I think it'd be great for you to bring those tips up, and then we will definitely, though, focus on each of you developing 5 distinctive voices, writing down notes. Do you have something to write notes on? Are you going to lose those, or are you going to be able to transpose those to something more permanent? Because this is something you want to have regularly.
Yeah.
So you're going to have on your notepads, each of you should have your own Game Master's notebook. You know, in either an electronic format or physical format, whatever works best for you, whether it's on your cell phone or whatever. Something you're going to keep your GM training notes in to go back and consult regularly. And so this would be the whole section on voicing. Now, there was another topic we wanted to cover for you, and I haven't had a chance to watch the video.
The grid.
Grid? Oh, roster.
Roster, yes.
That was it.
Yes.
That was it. Okay. I've covered it with some of some people, but I don't think... Dan in Brazil, did we ever cover creating a Game Master roster? Have you been part of that?
No, not really. In what regard is a roster? A roster of what?
Of your player character and player information at your table.
I usually use Roll20, so that also acts as a roster within the game. So
yeah, but what are you going to do? Let's say you don't have internet access if you're running a game at a party or somewhere for people. Because my assumption here, you know, is that you're going to be running games. You may run them online, but we're trying to train you that you're going to be running games in person without a lot of access to technology or internet.
Oh, right. In that case, I generally use mobile devices. In this case, I have OneDrive. Any cloud service will do, because they usually, while they do upload to the cloud, they have a local save as well. So even without internet access, the only thing that hurts is that it won't upload until you have internet access anymore. So that's at least my preference. There may be better alternatives depending on circumstance.
So, and that's fine, and that's a reasonable solution as long as that works for you, and there's nothing wrong with that by itself. The only thing I will say, though, from my research on RPG optimization is the more screens that are at the table, the lower the average immersion level, and the less likely it is that participants will experience flow state for prolonged periods of time. I have theories about why that is. I don't have a solid explanation. I have theories about it, but what I have found empirically, time and time again, whether it's a cell phone or a large screen or a laptop or whatever, whether it's used specifically just to look up game rules, what have you, whether it's putting it on the table or a projector overhead, the more you have an electronic screen at the table, at least to now I haven't tested this with VR and AR and MR and XR. That's a whole other thing that I'm working on, but I don't have data on that yet. But I've seen time and time again lower scores for immersion and lower frequent occurrence of flow state the more screens are at the table. And that can be as simple as just a cell phone. And that includes what the DM uses. Now, I'm a huge advocate for technology, and where it works, I'm always an advocate for it. I have some disabilities, like with writing and such, with dysgraphia and such, so using a laptop or something to keep my notes is very helpful compared to my chicken scratch. But I generally, now here it's different because it's a studio and we're broadcasting, but generally my games that I run both professionally and personally, at most I might have a laptop, but really it's much better if there's no technology at the table. I try to have everybody mute their phones and not be looking at them. Don't use any laptops or pads and such to look at PDF rules, things like that. And when they do that, they consistently get higher immersion rates and better recurrences of flow state. And that means that they had a more intense and better game experience. It also means their overall scores of enjoyment of the game are higher. So that's the only problem with that approach, with using your cell phone or something like that. Also, if you're using your cell phone, that's a pretty small screen to be looking at all the different stats of your PCs and such as far as what's kept on the roster. You know, you can kind of flip from PC to PC, but it is slower than having it all right there on a piece of graph paper. You know, oops. There's some of my Beirut stuff. On a piece of graph paper where you can look at it all in one glimpse and keep status notes and all of that. So again, whenever you can use technology, great. I'm a big supporter of it, but it is something to be aware of that you may actually be taking away from your game slightly or significantly, depending upon the people, by having too much technology at the table. So that's just something to be aware of. So we will cover that as well. And then, excuse me, and then we'll see where we're at on time as far as additional topics after that. Danielle, have you rejoined us? Did we lose Danielle? Do I need to refresh?
She appears to be muted for me, and that's a good connection.
Okay, I'm going to refresh in case it's on, but you don't hear her?
No.
Okay.
In fact,
Danielle, try. Yeah, I know. Danielle, try disconnecting and reconnecting. Or she stepped away for a minute for something. All right, let me get that saved as another document. Okay. So I think while we're waiting for Danielle and warming up voices, and Danielle's already had a little bit of exposure to the discussion on rosters, so let's go ahead and start with the roster. Dan in Brazil, do you have any graph paper handy? Hello, Dan in Brazil.
It's over.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm not really, not on hand, but I can move around for a little bit.
Okay, if you can't find graph paper, then just some standard lined paper will get by.
Right, I'll get right to it.
Okay, so go and hurry and find that, and we'll wait a minute. So there's some great additional things to do, like what John does with the initiative tracking with these folded pieces of paper. Mm-hmm. And these are similar to the roster approach, and some people use these exclusively instead of a roster approach. And this is a great thing. So you put these up here, and I think it's the only one I have right now, so we'll just pretend I've got more of them. And so John does this to keep track of, he actually does it this way, the picture.
Yeah.
To keep track of initiative, right, and then move it as each person. And this is a nice way to keep track of initiative, and it has some stats on the back, and you've got a view, etc. So it's not a bad thing, and it may be sufficient in lieu of a roster. However, it's tricky. You have to take it down, write on it, put it back every time you want to do like a status note, like their condition, things like that. Any additional notes, let's say they pick up a cursed item, or some other thing that you want to make a note of. In the worlds of Beirut, the players, I don't think realize yet that anything that's more Dredian and has actual little silver tracing in it, that's actually lightly magically imbued for tracking, so that Mordred and Morgana Le Fay can track all their soldiers around the world at any given time. I mean, they have to invoke effort, but they can see where units are and such on this magical map, that they can see what all their forces are real time. And since the party has been stealing Mordredian equipment, they basically have a bunch of GPS tracking devices on magical versions, and they don't know it. And since they didn't get rid of that one rider who got away, that's going to come back to bite them later, depending upon how they do going north. they're going to be pursued by at least 50 more Dreadians now. So, well, I hope Danielle gets back soon.
I'm here.
Okay, good.
Hey.
So the other topic we're covering, Danielle, is rosters, keeping a GM roster.
Yeah.
Now, I think you've had a little bit of training on that before, right? We've covered that with you before. Danielle?
Yes, to a certain degree. We went over what you do for a roster, what John does for a roster, and kind of discussed what would be needed, especially like for me at the time. It was more focused on no thank you evil.
Right.
So the minimum.
Yep. So
Kind of a minimalist one that I have.
right. So we're gonna cover that first while everybody's voices kind of warm up, and then we're gonna go into the voices for NPCs and such. Do you have any graph paper handy, Danielle?
No, but I have lined paper.
Yeah, you can get by with lined paper. It's easier if it's graph, but you can get by with lined paper. So go ahead and get yourself some scratch paper.
I already came prepared.
Okay, good.
Except for my pen isn't working.
Well, better to use a pencil.
That's true. You can go ahead and start talking because I'm around. I'll just be looking for a pencil, which shouldn't take
Dan in
long.
Brazil, did you find some paper?
I have a whole cup in front of me.
Good. Dan in Brazil, what was that?
I found some paper, but unfortunately I live in a very technological household, so we have a dearth of lined and graph paper.
I understand.
But I have some white paper.
Keep in mind you can always grab graph and lined paper and even roster types from the internet and then print them on your printer. So you can find pre-made rosters of many kinds for many different game systems. This goes all the way back to AD&D with the Dungeon Master's Adventure Log. I'll get two of these. One to share with you again. I'll get somewhere else. All right, well. So, I started doing this back in the 70s, and they made products but this is 1983, but they made products specifically available for tracking your adventures. And lots of different companies and game systems do this, some more than others. Tor, which we will cover a little bit, has a lengthy adventure log process because you have your different phases between travel and creating safe havens and all of that. So there's a lot of information you need to keep track of in an organized way and at a glance. And there's you can find online a number of PDFs for that for specific to Tor. So we'll start with this classic AD&D example, and then I'll give you some examples for some other systems about some of the information that is tracked. Now, in this particular one, in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Fantasy Adventure Module Dungeon Master's Adventure Log, this was part number, or invoice number 9036 way back when. Here is a sample adventure log page. This is where I wish I had these kind of scanned in instead to do an overlay. But, and this is an example one filled out. So we're going to go over this. And what I want you guys to do with your first piece of paper is you're going to put your paper in landscape mode, not portrait, so you have more width rather than vertical. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have, now it has on here character number. That can actually be helpful for at a glance tracking. If you're doing a lot of different groups each time, your player count is going to change from session to session, and it can be useful information that you want to track. And so if you want at a glance, the very first one that they have on here, and so we're just going to follow their template, and then we'll talk about the others, is your character number or player number. So very small, it just needs to fit one digit, unless you're doing huge groups. Very small vertical column, of number. It can be player number, character number, PC number, whatever you want to place. And then that basically, I try to, once everybody's seated, I try to go clockwise consistently. And for you guys as training in RPG research, we try to do, if we're doing anything in a circular pattern, we try to do it clockwise. Mm-hmm. So just, if I'm looking at player number 3, I can go 1, 2, 3. I know that the third one on the video or whatever from the GM's left is number 3 on here. And so I can take notes accordingly. Mm-hmm. Same with player archetype specialists. So we do consistently clockwise, and then we try to get people to stay in the same seating unless there ends up being some sort of personality conflict or kids who keep picking on, siblings, things like that. I try to catch that before the roster is made. If we've got 2 brothers together or something, and if they're really supportive, that's one thing. If it looks like they got some sibling rivalry issues going on, then I try to put them kind of not even opposite each other because that's too close. Yeah. Kitty corner, basically as far away from each other as possible, works better. It becomes less disruptive to the game. However, some brothers and sisters are very supportive, so sometimes it's better, especially if one's considerably younger than the other and one's helping them out. Mm-hmm. So in that case, it's better to have them together. So these are all little considerations as you're getting people placed at the table. Now, this particular roster accommodates up to 10 players. Because remember, Gary Gygax regularly ran D&D games with 20 players. Which, oh, man. I've done that. I ran a campaign segment for about a month with 20 players. It's doable, but it has a lot of challenges, but that's for another discussion. So that's the first column. The next column, you're going to want a little bit more room. Now, in here, they have a separate column for player name and character name. If you have the graph or lined paper, I usually put those in the same column. And I put the first line is the character name, and the second line is the player name. Because I like to get in the habit of referring to the characters, especially when we have 3 people with roughly the same name. It's easier to reference the character name.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly, Dan, and Dan. Daniel, and Danielle.
I was like, I am not a Dan. That is my dad's name.
I know. But you get my point. Mm-hmm. So, and usually that's less likely that you're going to have the same character names. So I like to put player or character name first, and then below that, on the second line, character name. Now, since we usually try to limit our groups to no more than 6, an absolute max of 8, what you also want to do is you're going to do some horizontal lines with about 4 spaces down. So you've got your top column is your column header. The next line down, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then at the bottom of the 4th one, put a horizontal line all the way across the page. And then you're going to do that 8 times, potentially, at least 6 times, however much fits on your paper, with a gap of 4 lines for each one. And sorry, don't like to have dead air, but everybody needs a little bit of time to draw those lines. Of course, if you have a ruler, that can help to make straighter lines, but nobody's going to be judging you on the straightness of your lines as long as it's clear enough that you can keep track.
I'll be judging myself.
Okay. I mean, basically, you're making a spreadsheet. Well, yeah, Dan, as an artist, we better have straight lines.
We have tools. One of them is a straight edge.
But isn't that part of the tests? Like when we got graded on being able to do good circles, good lines. I mean, I'm talking a long time ago, but
not really.
Really?
They care more about understanding the various structures that you're working on.
Okay.
And developing straight lines and perfect circles. That's more into the quality of your work, and they're going to care more about the quality than can you do a straight line, because some people can do a straight line, and they still don't understand the structure of the human body to draw it properly.
Cool.
My design class required us, so.
But then
it's
again,
going to vary.
But then again, I also went to a college where they've already closed, and yeah.
Sorry, man. All right.
I'm actually quite happy about it because I was very pissed off with the college.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that was such a bad experience. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So now again, on this roster, it's progressing to the right, but we have 2 more spaces, and a typical one I like to put is race/gender on the 3rd line. So you're what you're going to do right now is just write a placeholder that says race/gender, but you would actually write it in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the first one is going to be char name, second one player name, third one race/gender.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth one is going to be class/level. Now you can mix this up a little bit, as I do. Sometimes I put in 5 or 6 lines per character instead of, so I shrink some of the columns and use more rows, but we'll keep it just to 4 for now, because it's a little more confusing verbally otherwise. So then in the next column, for D&D, if you're using alignment, you're going to want a column for alignment. And in this case, one reason to have a separate column is compliance with alignment. So underneath that, in the lines below it, you can make notes about if their alignment got changed because of magic, their alignment, they're in peril of an alignment change because they violated. You can do little chip marks for violations, or you can do chip marks for compliance. You can give rewards for people doing a good job of complying with their alignment, even though it might not be in the best interest of tactical or strategic situation, but they were playing their character to their alignment. Again, if you use alignment, you can have a chip marks for success and for failure, and then that way you can kind of track how some players are doing in conform, and you can give them a warning. Hey, your character's getting dangerously close to having an alignment shift. If you're a paladin, that's catastrophic, for example.
Yeah.
In 1st edition and such.
Up till 3rd edition.
Yeah. Then they kind of put a lot less stress on alignment. So, as there's been more and more moral relativism and less absolutes, accepted in society, that's another discussion. So, so that's why that could be useful as a separate column, is to track such things. Let's see. Then the next one on this, now again, this isn't my roster. This is what the AD&D version, this is what they published, and we're going to do it from left to right. It's not the perfect roster, but it's a great starting point for the concept of roster and the things you want to track. So on here they have next, this is a pretty large one, so you can have a pretty large column here for special abilities, magical items, or personal abilities. So special abilities / magical items / personal abilities. And it's a pretty wide column. Now you're still going to have a few more columns, so make sure you still have lots of space left.
Okay.
I forgot to change our title for the broadcast. It's still showing Hoops of Mirkwood. Give me a second.
One question, Hope.
Yes.
One question, Hope. I know this is a little bit off topic, but just a yes or no answer will be fine. Wasn't alignment a setting-specific mechanic in the original D&D?
It was alignment what?
A setting-specific mechanic from a particular setting.
It was standard from AD&D 1st edition and 2nd edition for all character classes, but it was always an option for GMs. But it was highly defined in the character class structure. So if you were a paladin, you had to be lawful good. If you deviated, you lost all your paladin powers. They had alignment languages. Again, these were all things that DMs could decide how much to use. But in the core rules, it was a core rule. Give me a second here. I got to update the title before somebody complains. Some people are nitpicky about the titles. Updated it. I know it's too late for the cooldown thing, but at least it should update the title there. All right. Next on this roster is combat adjustments. So these are be to hit and to damage. Various considerations. They might be long-term considerations, they might be transient, and again, this is an area where I actually go significantly differently, but we're going to make a separate roster with my changes to this to improve it. And in this case, it's a fairly skinny column, even though I do it differently. And then the next one they have, and this one is in between, not as wide as the special abilities, but not super skinny. Armor class and type. Which I do the other way. I do type and then class, but that's fine. Then the next column is a fairly skinny one because it only needs to handle up to 3 digits usually. Hit points. Now on this published log, you'll see that what we just did only takes up half of the page. Don't worry if yours is totally different, that's okay. So again, this is the difference between using a pre-published one versus creating our own. We're going to refine it. But then they have a separate section for, and this is where the numbers come in handy to cross-reference. But again, on ours, we like to just do one big spreadsheet. Doing it this way is clunky unless you're using a pre-printed thing. It has the PC number, and then the, forget it, type is on here. I have to actually look that up. It's been so long since I used this old one. Type. It's got codes. I don't remember. It's been so long. So in the beginning of it, you have all the codes and such that they recommend using. Missing a page? No. Okay, treasure number, treasure type. Okay, never mind. So this half on this roster is all player stuff, right? The first half is all player, and the other half is all related to the NPCs and such. So they have a little section in here for marching order. And these are good things to have. And watch order. Also light sources. And these are just little sections they stick here and there. Again, we'll do a more organized version that puts this together. And then it has basically a little mini roster for the NPCs. And what I do is I usually have a separate roster if I have a lot of NPCs as opposed to just little breakouts. I'll have a separate page on my spreadsheet that I create that has the stats I need for NPCs. I don't put that on the PC roster. That's a lot of erasing, and you very quickly wear through the paper.
Yeah.
Periodically, this roster you'll have to recreate because the paper will get so thin you'll start to tear through. So from time to time you have to create a new one, but that's a quick process of just copying. Again, if you do keep it tracked electronically in a spreadsheet, then it's easy enough to just print it out. So that's always an easy option. So we're not gonna cover NPC roster right now. We might do that later if we have time. We're focusing on the PC roster for now. And then so anyway, they include like the treasure and things like that. And then there's also a section for unusual events. So significant events is how I would phrase it. And they have examples of Magic Chair Fred 9802 talked back to Odin and lived. So these are notable events that happen in the adventure that the GM wants to make note of. Fire Giant, Knock Grafton, pocketed Ring of Delusion without knowledge of party. Right? So all these little important things that happen that you want to remind yourself of. In Heroes of the Mist, took Mordredian equipment that's being tracked, for example, and who's carrying it. Grabbed a cursed item, right? Took the cursed such and such a sword and doesn't realize that it's a sword of clumsiness or something, or armor of clumsiness, what have you. Yeah. So those are important. They do have a separate, longer roster for more detailed non-player characters on a whole separate sheet. They do this in portrait format, but it's as they meet different NPCs as kind of the long-term NPCs that you're going to run into. So on the first roster, it's more kind of the short-term ones that you run into in encounters. This one is more tracking long-term NPCs, people you're going to encounter over time and repeatedly, royalty, contacts, etc. One great addition to this book that I really do like is it included these detailed pictures of equipment, weapons and armor. It shows the different armor and the different pieces of armor and the different helmet types. And this was it was nice they included it. When people were unclear about the different types of armor, it was very handy. Alright, so that's all they generally include in this printed version of the roster. There's a lot more that I like to include. They usually have a separate log that you keep track as far as experience point values and things like that. And remember, older D&D was a little more mechanical than newer versions. So, let's see if I can find... a lot of different rosters here. So here is one that I did in, this looks like it's Tor. Okay, this one's AIM. So AIM is based on 5th edition D&D. So let's make another roster, a fresh roster here. So this is basically what I would use for an AIM setting, Adventures in Middle-earth, aka a 5th edition one, but it has a few extras that are not in standard 5th edition. So new roster, new piece of paper here. And this one, our rows are going to be 5 across. So if you're going to have your heading, and you're going to, and above that heading, you need to have enough space to write in 5 or 6 different items, because you might have a larger category and some subcategories. But you need a large, otherwise you got to use your first few lines up, your first 5 lines. But then each PC is going to have 5 lines in each row.
Okay.
So each row is going to have 5 spaces that you can write in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So here's the top of your line, and then the bottom of 5. So you've got 5 spaces to write in. So write those rows across. You with me so far, Dan and Brazil and Danielle?
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't even have line paper, but I can make do. I'm writing down the notes about how many lines across every.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, do like a design document.
Yeah, design document.
Yeah.
Precisely.
There you go. Or if you have a ruler, if you have a ruler, you can always do it that way too.
I don't have anyone of such station handy now.
Okay. No worries. All right. The first column this one's crammed a little full. Is going to be char name. And you're going to see even between systems there'll be some consistencies.
So, do we ignore character number for this one?
I don't usually use character numbers, but you're welcome to. So again, I'm showing you different options. Each GM will piece together their preferred roster. There'll be some things they say you must have. Character number is optional. It can be helpful if you're cross-referencing information. So nothing wrong if you want on the far left-hand side a skinny little column that says char num. Feel free to do that, or just number. But then the next significant column, which is going to be larger, because you've got to be able to write in character names and stuff like that, so it's going to be pretty good size. On my graph paper, this next column after number would be, on this larger graph paper, would be 6 squares to the right to provide enough room to write. So it starts with char name, then below that is player name, or just player. Below that is race/culture. Below that is background/gender. And then the final line is class/level. So basically it starts, more fundamental and gets more and more specific to the characters, development and such. So char name, player name, race/culture, background/gender, and class/level. So background has a very specific meaning in AIM, about where you're coming from and such. It's between race and between class. They have background. So that's why that needs to be included in AIM. It's not a detailed background. In this case, a background would be emissary, or loyal servant, or lure of the road, things like that. So these are things that you select during your character generation that summarize special abilities and knowledge and such that are pretty critical. So you want to know these things. You as the GM want to know. And over time you'll know exactly, oh, lure of the road, I know that includes these features, etc. But you're always going to want to have that in your face to remind you, because you're going to say things to specific character players based on what their background is in AIM. So it's an important part of AIM. Not really the same thing under straight 5th edition, but for AIM it's very important. All right, in the next column, which I only have 3 squares to the right on that one, and you can move this around as you want. I keep changing it. So the first one would be passive perception, right? Because that's one that comes up a lot. And every time you have to ask them,
It's kind of a heads up.
so because I'll just tell them, yeah, exactly. If I tell them just roll a d20, they don't know what they're rolling for. But if I don't know what their passive perception is, and I tell them, roll a d20 and tell me what your passive perception is, I've just given away that they need to be aware of something. And that ruins some of the fun. So it's really important to have that passive perception there. You're going to use it a lot. And then the others you can kind of move around as you need to. Initiative. Hit points are just HP. Condition. So I might say stunned, wounded, bleeding, unconscious, dead, what have you. And you know, in a role-playing gaming, dead's not necessarily a permanent condition.
Yeah.
And then armor/AC. Now in that case, you might want to make it 4 squares to the right instead of 3, because I noticed it's been pretty cramped. But you can use abbreviations for armor. So like SL for studded leather, you know, BND for bandit, things like that, and then / the armor class. Now sometimes I have a whole separate column for all the different armor classes. So the next column is the other armor classes. So you get, in this case, so a lot of times just armor/AC and I'm done. In this case, take the AC off of that or just put it in parentheses, whatever, that's an option. Now we have another column, and this one only needs to be 2 blocks to the right for different types of AC. So it's going to be full, no shield, or I just do NOSH, helm ? Greaves ? And shield. So that's going to, you know, so then below you would fill in what their armor class is, their full armor class, maxed out, full frontal, dexterity, with shield, everything. Then what their armor class is without a shield, because that's a very common condition. Do they have a helm? I just put a question mark on that and it's a yes or no, or it's a type. I might say full, you know, pot, partial, whatever. Because I include criticals and specific hit stuff, so a helm could be the difference between being knocked, like a sap. First edition D&D introduced the sap. It only does 1 hit point of damage. But based on your strength, it has a percentage chance of just automatically knocking you out unless you have a helm. If you have a helm, it doesn't work, or if it's partial helm, it's a reduced chance of success. If you have an 18 double out strength with a sap, you get 100% success. If you hit them, and usually you're sneaking up behind, but even you can use it in combat, it's a little broken, but I've had fun with it. If you hit them with a sap, and you have an 18 double out strength, there's a 100% chance you will knock them out if they don't have a helmet. So, the helmet, for lots of reasons, is useful to know. It also is good for perception. Usually having a helmet on means they're not going to hear things or see things as well as their party members, especially if it's a full helm. Greaves. So greaves can be anything. It can be bracers, it can be full greaves. I usually just put like AL for arms leather and LL for legs leather, or AS for steel, whatever, or metal, you know, you use whatever coding you want. But that's important again for criticals, whether they broke something, whether they're burned by something, etc. And then the last one is what it says shield. It's what kind of shield. Is it small wooden? Is it large, etc.? You know, and then maybe what the bonus is on it. It might have a magical bonus, etc. So that's why those are there. So then the next column, it's fairly large because you need to be able to write full words in it. It's 7 squares to the right. Now remember, we've added from Tor Fellowship Focus. Fellowship Focus is not part of AIM. We ported it over from Tor, and I don't know why they left it out, because it's such an important thing. And if you're interested in our house rules on how to port the One Ring role-playing games Fellowship Focus into AIM, we have the PDF available, I think, on SpokaneRPG.com. But you just do a search for Fellowship Focus AIME, space AIME, or Adventures in Middle Earth. I think you'll be able to find the PDF. So I start with Fellowship, so that's the Fellowship Focus for the top of that column. Then the next one I have Shadow Weakness. Then Shadow Points. Then Weary/Miserable, which is another type of condition, but it's separate from their physical condition, even though it's interrelated. Then I leave the last one for different options if you want. You could, for example, put havens, or a haven, but usually one line isn't enough, so usually on the next one is where I put a haven. So I kind of leave that blank for whatever else I feel I want to put in. So again, these things change. I'm always refining and improving. I'm just trying to give you examples. You will create your own that works best for you. Mm-hmm. The next column is about the same size and starts with active perception. Any special abilities I should make note. Actually, I'll put that at it. So, actually, move this around a little bit. The top one I usually put as havens, and then I skip a line, and then I go to active perception and skip a line, and then I have at the last part is special, for special abilities that I should be aware of. The next column, this is even a little bit larger. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's 10 blocks to the right. This is weapons/mod/magic/hit/damage. So you do wep/mod/mag/hit/DMG. And there's nothing else below that because this allows you to have multiple items, multiple weapons for that one character. So that whole column is just use that. And you just put it in. Short sword, +2, magic yes or no, or I could put the magic mod separately if I want. Like it could be masterwork versus magic. The hit modifier, the damage, /damage modifier. In the next column, which is about the same across, about 10, is just basically a lot of notes. So at the top I put notes, and then at the bottom of that one I put day number or date. Sometimes I put in there when the campaign started, like up and like on somewhere on the piece of paper separate. I usually put what the campaign name is. I forgot to mention this. At the very top above everything, and I'm sorry, I forgot. I usually put what the campaign is, what the game system is, what the real world start date was for this campaign, and then what the adventure start date was. And then in this section here with the notes, I'm tracking the actual current date and time. So date/time. That way if we stop at a certain point, I can make a note. Oh, we stopped on Friday the 3rd, 3rd age 2094 at 2 p.m. That's where the character time stopped until our next session. So that's handy to have in. But otherwise, it's just lots of notes and information. I keep track of any extra, like if it didn't fit in the other columns, this is where I put some additional special abilities, special conditions, special encounter notes, anything they grabbed, just any of those notes that I think are of value. I also put in here sometimes, let's see, I forget what it's called under AIM, trusty, reckless, keen-eyed, fair-spoken. These are specific personality descriptions from each one, and I forget the name for that, but those can all go notes. And then the final column is XP, for experience points. So as they are racking them up for role play or killing monsters or what have you, these are usually here as individuals, these are the bonus XP as an individual. I may have, when they do an encounter and there's shared XP and then I just split up between them, I don't usually write that in this column unless I'm at the final stages of calculating. This is usually where I track all the bonus XP, and it's usually kind of, it's not too big a column at the end there, but it's worth having handy there because you fill that in all the time and then periodically give all those out. Now again, there are many different ways to lay this out. You're going to find what works best for you, but I'm just giving you some examples of the things to include. For example, some of the other considerations, as I said, marching order, watch order, light sources, those are all things worth potentially putting in here in some of the other spaces if you want. You can do it as another column, you can do it as add another line to your row, however you want, whatever works best for you. I'll give another example here from Twilight 2000, which we did recently. So Twilight 2000 is also an old game, but it has different things to account for frequently. You don't need to write this one down because you guys aren't running Twilight 2000, so I'm just going to, now you've got kind of an idea of what we're doing, I can just give you another example of this. So this one is 5 lines per character, and the first column starts with the character name, the player name, the rank, because remember it's a military game, so what their rank is, their branch, and their specialty. The next column over, and it's only about 3 squares, has various key skills that get used a lot. For example, recon, which is detecting ambush and scouting for stuff, foraging, scrounge, and medical. Those are highly used, and knowing the percentages on those can help me in reminding people of stuff to do. Initiative, current condition, marching order or position, right, where they are in the convoy, etc. Coolness under fire. These are each separate ones that are worth tracking. Then you have all the different weapons, so you have one whole column, weapon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so each of those I just put what the weapon is and maybe any notes if necessary. Usually it's sufficient in Twilight just to list the weapon, and then I can just cross-reference what's needed. Then the next one is a lot of skills that are going to get used a lot, especially in combat. So the main purpose of this roster in this case is really speed up combat. I don't have to keep asking what people's stuff is, and then I can remind them of new players. So I might have, after weapon, all the column information for the weapon, so I don't have to look it up every time on my chart. I've got their weapon info. So cross-referencing that weapon info, I might have rate of fire, magazine, range, damage, whether it's armor piercing or not, its knockdown radius, its burst radius, whether it's indirect fire, and whether it has radiation. So those are all things I might have after weapon. Then the next one is just going to be additional skills. So I might have languages, and all the different languages they speak at what percentage. That's going to be critical, that they might overhear something in a language they're not using at the moment, but all of a sudden they hear something in German. They may only have a 30 in German, so you may only give them pieces of information. Really important to have that language information. And then any other additional skills you think might be worth putting there. And then we go over to notes and experience. So that's another example there. Let's see if there's anything worth noting with, let's see, Justice of the Blade, Saltmarsh. This is first edition. Okay. You might include like your house membership or organization membership. That might be an important thing if you use a lot of guilds or noble class groups and such, alliances, anything like that might be important to consider because you may have an automatic, your character may have an automatic morale or response modifier to somebody. So for example, you may come across an opposing house, and I'm not going to tell you, but you may not even be aware, but all of a sudden, you know, you feel really angry, and you look around and you see House Gessold, you know, one of the members of House Gessold has just walked into the room and first you didn't realize what set you off until now you see that person. Well, since I have that house information and I know the story that they're opposing houses, that's going to be important. House Harkonnen in Dune or something, you know. Let's see. Okay, that's all AIM. I thought I had one here that was specific to Tor that was a little different because it was Tor. That was both AIM. But they end up looking like this to various degrees. And but you have to get in the habit of using it. First, this will take you longer, and you may be a little frustrated that you're taking the time to put this together. It's better if you do it before people show up, if you have the character sheets, and just do it on your own. But often, I'm so busy and such that I have to do it during game session 0, when we're getting everybody ready, and as their characters get finished, or they pick out their characters. Especially if they're new players, it's actually then worth going through and asking them one by one, because then they learn where to look these things up.
Yeah.
So if you have new players who aren't familiar with that game, like they've never played before, or they're just new to a new game, they don't know where things are on the character, then it's better that you actually do the roster with them in session 0, rather than doing it on your own, because then they get practice of where to look things up. And you do it for each of them, help each of them walk through. Now, some games, private information is critical. So, for example, like Vampire and other things, or Paranoia, you don't want to do all that information. So you would do the information that is okay to know, but the other information you're going to want to do privately, either ahead of time or separately. So you always keep that in mind. Sometimes you don't want players to know other player character information, and so be mindful of that when you're doing your process for setting up rosters. Questions and comments on this?
I feel that I'm not exactly. Sorry, just sit back on the. I hear my voice from your end. One moment.
Go ahead.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I'm muting on my end so it doesn't give you the feedback.
Right, thank you. So, I only have a bit of a hard time drawing the graph because there are lots of new systems with lots of terms that I'm not quite used to, so it's hard to see the significance of many of these fields. So when you get into the details of the systems, I'm kind of lost, and basically the way that I'm interpreting is, okay, we have these very specific measurements for this roster, and these are the important little things I need to keep track of, as opposed to things that I don't quite need to have on hand at all times. But without knowing the system, then I can't separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
And that's okay, because the point is you're going to create a roster that works for you for the game that you're running. I'm just giving you some different examples of things to consider. It will obviously vary from system to system and setting to setting, and it's just getting you started with these examples. So you can use these as a template, but these are not rigid. Each of you will have your own variant for doing this. Now, here when we're doing programs, when we're doing organized formal programs, I am working on trying to standardize our roster. That'll be a printed version, so that you guys just have it ready to go, and all of us know the same variables and are trained the same way. But that's just for the core 5 systems and such. But as a GM running your own stuff, the key thing is just that you understand this basic process. And then some of the core key recommendations I made, like for example, character name first, then player name, things like that. And generally you start, you got your stuff on the left, and you get more and more specific to the right until you get kind of to notes and XP. But it's going to vary, and it doesn't. There's no one right way to do this. The key thing is that you do it and track your most frequent. Basically, track how often you ask a player for information. If it's something you're asking constantly, you should probably just put it on your roster. So look for, first of all, the most frequently asked questions. So whatever your FAQ is, put that on your roster. If you're asking it all the time of each of the players, that's slowing the game down. The game will go a lot faster if you have that at your fingertips rather than having to ask every time.
Like one that I've already kind of added in, and this is just something that I tend to keep track of. In the same vein of having a passive perception, I try to keep track of people's passive insight.
Okay.
Which is basically their insight modifier for 5th edition,
Yep.
plus 10.
Okay.
That way, I can determine whether or not they'd be able to see if someone's lying to them without necessarily asking,
Sure.
maybe an insight check.
Whatever works for you. Oh, it fell out of my head. Oh, so first was frequently asked questions. So whatever you ask constantly that's slowing the game down to keep asking, have those on there first. Then the stuff that you don't ask as often, but are relevant, pertinent, and important to roleplay, and that you don't want to have to ask them. So that, in other words, asking them gives something away, and it's going to come up from time to time, and it's critical to your campaign. Have those on your roster. So the things that, if you ask them in the game, it's going to give away that they need to be on their toes for something. You want that written down in your roster rather than having to ask them. Then you can just say, okay, go ahead and roll percentile. Well, what for? Just roll percentile. I've got the modifier. I don't need to tell you what it is. And then you can give them the result based on that. You can use the narrative of what happened rather than the numbers, and that helps keep more suspension of disbelief, but also suspense too. Keep people on their toes without them knowing what to be on their toes about.
Yeah, like delicious food.
That was a nice touch.
That makes sense, and it really helps bring out how the roster interacts organically with the campaign and lubricate the gear, so to speak. That
Exactly.
helps with fixating what it's for and what it should be.
Exactly.
Helps me a lot. Thank you.
You bet. And now I used to run games when I was, whether it was Rollmaster, AD&D, whatever. I actually, at one point for years, I did almost all of the rolling. So I did the math, I did the rolling, and my roster was much more detailed because of that. And I would only occasionally have to ask the players for less common stuff. And then I only gave the dice to the players for really critical stuff. Like, I'd hand them the percentile or D20, go, all right, everything's riding on this roll here, and everybody's leaning forward going, oh my goodness, what's this? So now the roll is really significant when I handed them the die. Now back in the 80s, I didn't have any trouble with people being okay with this. I mean, it wasn't the standard way of running the game. Everybody rolled their own dice. But especially when I ran larger groups, but also, and that's where it started. I started doing that with larger groups because it took too long for me to wait for everybody else to declare their action, roll, do the modifiers, etc. And I was just way faster at doing the calculations than most of them were. So it was just faster if I had a large group of 20 players at a table for me to do the rolls and do the math and give them the result. I then tried that with the smaller groups just to see, and what I found that did is the players stopped focusing on the min-maxing as much and stopped focusing on the numbers and stayed in the game, in immersion more, because they weren't having to stop and switch into math mode. They weren't having to sit there and calculate and look at their character sheet all the time for statistics. They were able to just focus on visualizing what was happening in the game or following the miniatures, etc. And so they were able to stay in their imagination more rather than having to switch brain hemispheres and do calculations and such. So I had great success with that. And that was back when I knew my systems backwards and forwards. There were fewer games back then, and I had a lot of the stuff memorized. The additional advantage to doing this, and this depends on your GM philosophy about this particular topic. One of the advantages of the GM controlling the role, and again, this assumes that you are a benevolent GM and not a, dictator, jerk, control freak.
Authoritarian?
Yeah, and a killer GM and a cheater GM and stuff. This assumes you're a beneficent, caring GM who wants the party to do well and wants the story to go on. but also is willing to kill off characters, etc. So sometimes...
Don't worry, I stopped playing GURPS in 10 years, I think.
What's that?
Don't worry, I stopped playing GURPS after 10 years.
That has nothing to do with the game system. This is totally whether the GM has a conflicted and confrontational experience. If the players and the GM are competitive versus cooperative. You know, we're always trying to encourage that's cooperative. We as the GM are there to support the players' success and fun and their character campaign, you know, doing well. At the same time, they still have to have consequences to actions, etc. But the nice thing, if you're controlling the roles, is you can fudge it if you need to for a dramatic effect. Now, you got to be very sparing with this. And generally, I only fudged on the side of if something really stupid happened in the dice roll, like it was not going to fit the story at all, and it was a lame way for a character to die. Now, I had no problem if they got injured or weakened or whatever, that's fine. But if they just, because of a roll, died, you probably just shouldn't even bother with the roll, right? First of all, if there's no way you want somebody to just lamely die for a dumb reason, then you probably shouldn't even roll. You should just stick to narrative for that, where you have the control.
Can you give me an example of what would be a dumb reason? Because from my experience, the standard for what is dumb or not tends to differ from GM to GM.
Yeah, that's going to be a judgment call. But for example, random encounters. Let's say you have a campaign setting that is not adjusted to player character level, right? Which I do. A lot of GMs will, like D&D and others, the encounters you have are always adjusted to the party strength, so you never are having too strong an opponent to take on. Like video games do that a lot, etc. There's a progression. Mm-hmm. I don't do that in my campaigns. In my campaigns, it's a world of danger, and if you go places that you shouldn't go, where the creatures are incredibly deadly, you're just going to die. I'm not going to level down the world because you were, novice and ignorant. They're about to go next to the Infernium in Worlds of Beirut. Incredibly deadly, dangerous place. They stick to the road. They're going to have some encounters, but they'll be manageable, mostly hiding. So, for example, at one point, there's going to be a dragon flying overhead. If they're stupid enough to try to take on the dragon, that's their fault if they take it on. But let's say you have a random encounter that says that, let's say you're rolling, let's say you have an event and you have an earthquake. Mm-hmm. And the earthquake's supposed to be dramatic and important to the story, like, there's a comet coming, destroying the planet, and you want these earthquakes happening. But you don't want to kill the characters. And let's say you roll for the earthquake and a tree from your random rolls falls on the party member and kills one of the party members and such. Now, if it's appropriate to the tension and danger of the story, then great, let them be killed, whatever. But if it's just too random, and here's the danger. You don't want your characters to feel that they have no say or control, that the world is so random that they're helpless, and it becomes a learned helplessness experience. This is a psychological term about learned helplessness.
They have no agency.
Yeah, if they have no sense of being able to affect the universe around them. If you're an over-controlling GM, and no matter what they do, it's going to go the way GM wants, you're going to have helpless players, and it's going to be very frustrating for all involved, at least for the players. So be very careful with random encounters, random events, things like that that can just take a character out. And there's times where it's just, if they're like walking along a cliff line, it's great to have the tension. But if I rolled that it would have killed them, I might fudge it to that it rolled to where it just broke their legs, right? It still has consequences. It still adds to the danger, and it's going to suck because they're going to have to make a litter or heal them or whatever. But so a crit roll, for example, just might not be that dramatically interesting, like in Rollmaster or something, to just take them out with one roll. But if you're up against the big boss and the bad guy and the big pinnacle, let your players, let the bodies hit the floor. Let your characters, not your players, let your characters' bodies hit the floor. Then it's the epic battle, and it's okay to let the characters start dying, because they've gotten to the big epic thing, or anywhere along the way where they lost Goosefeld and Rogar, and they'll be able to talk about their losses. So when it makes sense and it furthers the story in some dramatic way, then go ahead and let it happen. But sometimes you just get a roll. Again, should you even be rolling? right? And maybe you need to roll, but maybe you just need to make sure that that roll result is never fatal. It can just be extremely dangerous. So these are things you should take into account. But sometimes you don't realize that until you roll it and you go, you know, that would be really lame to kill the character off right now. That would just be lame.
Yeah.
And if you're controlling the rolls, you get to say, instead of killing him, oh, he's knocked into a coma or something.
That's kind of similar to like a promise that I've made with you know, my more permanent group that I work with, that you know, we tend to go all over the place, and I've told them that I will never kill them for the sake of comedy.
Okay.
So, for example, one game, the druid who really should have just stopped being a druid, he had a penchant for just setting things on fire. I'll give you one guess as to who was playing that.
Pyro.
Yes.
After that, Pyro, like he just set things on fire. Shocking.
Turns out he ended up setting the orc barbarian's favorite bar on fire. So,
Yeah.
to put out the fire, the orc barbarian used him to beat out the flames.
Okay.
Now, if I had done straight damage, you know, he was a 3rd level character. He would have died. I wasn't going to kill him for that.
Yeah, and that's another one, is... now again, if they do something stupid and you give them a chance to avoid and they still blunder into it, then they need to learn the hard lesson that their characters can die. Because that can be a great learning experience.
Yeah.
If I have new players who are coming from video games and they don't understand the concept of character death, they think they just respawn, then I'm okay with them dying quickly.
Yeah.
I want them to die within the first few levels before they get so invested that it's more traumatic. Because then they realize that it is dangerous that their characters can die, and that hour to 4 hours they put in their character, that kind of sucks. The next time they play, they're going to play differently. Every time. Once they've had a character death, especially if you do it quickly. If you do it when, again, if it seems arbitrary or kind of mid-level, and they've never died before, it could be a more traumatic experience for them, because now they're much more personally invested and all that time and everything, and they can be pretty deflated and not want to start over. You can lose players over that. Unless you get them used to the concept of character death, and it's no big deal, you can make another character and still keep the game going. So it's good to train people about character death pretty early on, again, but you don't want it to be too arbitrary. Hi there, Zane Awesome says hey in the chat room. Hey. Back. So again, this is something you could try experimenting with, maybe even just for one session. Now, I don't recommend it if you're not quick with your math and if you don't know your game system well. So you would only do the DM controls the roles thing if you are quite proficient in the game system that you're running and you're pretty quick with your math. If you're slow, you're going to slow the game down because it's a lot of variables to juggle in your head. But that's where a roster is even more critical to make the game. And that is how, as I said, I did really large groups. It was much faster for me to just have everything there and do the number crunching than wait for each person to do their calculations in different levels of processing speed. That's how I was able to make those games flow pretty quickly. Since I started gaming more heavily again since moving up here in 2004, I have yet to meet a single group that is comfortable with me doing all the dice rolls. I've got one group who's willing to give it a shot, and I just haven't followed through on it yet with them. But out of the several hundreds of players I've asked this question to, most of them have said, no, I'm not comfortable with that. And it's a very interesting shift, because I did not have that issue with players in the 80s. So I wonder what those reasons are about. I wonder if that's a social shift in our culture about feelings of learned helplessness and lack of power and control in their lives, and that needing to have that in the game helps them compensate for a lack of feeling control in their real life. I don't, it's not something I've done a formal study on, but it's something I would like to check out at some point. And of course, verify that my perceptions of a better game actually hold up in doing questionnaires and immersion and flow. I haven't done any of that formally, right? Because back in the 80s I did this before I formalized the research more. But you can see there in a situation like that, if you're GMing and you're doing a lot of the roles, a roster is critical for being able to move things along quickly. So
about the shift in the role playing and the importance of players rolling the dice, I think part of it could be the the recent exposure of RPGs in popular media, and the perception that, oh, in order to be a role-playing game, you need to roll the dice. It became sort of emblematic, perhaps, as an alternative, or as an alternative theory, perhaps.
Well, rolling the die has always been, or any randomizing agent, has always been part of role-playing gaming, and it was back then. And again, for really critical dramatic effect, I gave them the die to roll, right? And that made it so. Otherwise, rolling is just rolling. You just take it for granted, and you're rolling all the time. Now I hand you the die. All of a sudden, your adrenaline kicks up. Everybody's really focused. Ooh, this is a big deal because we're making this roll. You know, it might be a death save, your final death save for your character or something like that. So you can do this to various degrees, right? It is totally flexible about how much you have the players roll versus the GM. There should be rolling, and the GM can either be rolling by proxy or the player can be rolling directly. When you roll over roll 20 and stuff, you're rolling by proxy. You're not actually doing the rolling yourself. So there's various ways that you can consider this. But yes, the random agent is a key part of role-playing gaming, a key component. Whether it's chits or spinners or dice rollers or computer-based or whatever, that random agent that can be modified is a key part of role-playing gaming. But it's always been so. That hasn't changed. What has changed observationally seems to me, and again, I don't have this formally empirically backed up, but this is observational, just the attitude of needing to control the dice has shifted dramatically since the 80s. And I think, and I see it with some personality types, but I also see kind of an age cohort effect too. The younger folks seem to be much more adamant about that they do the rolling, a lot less trust of the GM. But it's something I'd love to do a study to delve into more deeply. But again, either way, whether you're doing all the rolling, they're doing the rolling, whatever, you can see all these different ways that a roster comes in really handy. And again, you can use a roster in conjunction with the initiative cards as you move the initiative cards around to keep track. And you've got summary information. But these are not easy to keep writing on. If you have to stop and write on them frequently, as John does, it slows the game down. Yeah. If you have it right here on your roster, it goes a lot faster, and then you just do this for keeping track.
Yeah, that's actually what I've been trying to do. Is I've been trying to prep it so that I can design basically a card tent, but with more permanent information that isn't going to be changing all that often.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and exactly. Put on the card the PC card tent, the non-changing info or rarely changing. Also, in the initiative column on the roster, instead of putting what the actual initiative, you just put their initiative modifiers. And then, once you know that modifier, then you just move them around accordingly.
Yeah.
It also is important if you're like doing Doctor Who, where initiative is based on their declaration of violence. You're going to want to make a note of that here, and then that's going to shift their position here. Yeah. So the combination of the roster with these initiative cards, tents, whatever you want to call them, is a powerful combination and can move things along pretty quickly. So I'm an advocate for using both.
Yeah.
They're not mutually exclusive at all. You can get by with one or the other, but the combination of the two is a good, powerful combination. Danielle, you've been silent. Do you have any commentary?
Not really. I do. I feel like the tents are what I've been relying on the most lately, and they really seem to help with the things I need to find.
Right, but I'm going to push you to learn to master both combined.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay. I was just saying, yeah. At this point, my strength is probably more in the tents than in the roster.
Sure.
Unless it's no thank you evil, then I do straight roster, and it's basically like, what's your character's name? What's your name?
Right.
And what's the thing that they took from their room?
Yeah, their companion, their equipment, their special abilities, exactly.
Yep.
Dan in Brazil, you were saying?
I'm rather liking this more than I expected because the roster in paper, the initiative cards, it really brings out the what would you say, the kinesthetic potential of role-playing games and visual aids and everything.
Good.
initiative it was always something that I struggled with, and even the electronic RPG aids or Roll20 have initiative systems that don't quite, they work, but they're not as useful as, say, what it would be on a table. And it's really nice to see these little simple tricks that would make something that for me is currently a nightmare turn into something much easier.
Yeah, and that's why we're here, to help make your lives easier, to be better GMs. Good. I'm glad you're finding that helpful. Anything else before we switch topics? Because that's pretty much what I was going to cover for rosters and such for today. Because that should be enough. Now it's just a matter of practice, right? Take these templates, create your own. You might want to create one in a spreadsheet and then print it out, with all the lines and spaces that you need. That's a very organized, professional way to do it. But if you don't have that, then just draw it up this way. You don't have to use tech. There's a whole gradient of how much tech and how little tech you want to use.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about doing it yourself is, of course, you get more consistency and you can print it out and use it that way. The drawback I found is, unless you include grid lines and such, it's a little harder to stay even unless you've got grid lines added.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes hard to do on a printer, get the fading right. But lots of different options there. So each of you will develop your own techniques and approaches, but I hope that gives you a good baseline and helps make you a better GM. So if there's nothing else on that, we're going to switch to doing voicing. We good to go for the transition?
Give me just a moment.
Okay, good. Did you have some questions or comments you wanted to make?
No, I'm just finalizing some thoughts.
Okay.
I don't know if it'll be good for me to do voicing.
Yeah.
I'll listen to the techniques, but I'm probably not going to be able to implement them, because even with the lozenge, I still sound really bad.
Okay, but some of the voicing techniques are not going to be about straining your voice. They're going to be actually about just adding variance in speaking. You don't have to do a ton, but we'd like to at least try to get you started on a few variants. But you use your judgment.
Danielle, just so you know, if your voice starts hurting, just tell us and we'll know. I've been to theater and I've also lost my voice. I've seen people lose their voice, and that's generally the threshold they use for when you need to take a break.
Yeah. Yesterday was just too much after coming off of that cold. Didn't realize how much I talked.
Yeah, I understand. All right, Dan, you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, we are now switching topics to discussing voice. I'm going to stop and start the recording because it's a separate topic.